and professor. She does it all. Okay, I better switch to English. Good evening, friends, colleagues, and students. I'm Bonna Westcote, Director of the American School of Classical Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our lecture on classical world. I also welcome those of you who are following us online. Our speaker this evening is Scarlett Kingsley, an excellent scholar and much admired teacher. It's our very good fortune that she is a Whitehead Distinguished Scholar here at the school this year. We've benefited greatly from her historical range, moving between antiquity and its reception in her Whitehead seminar, Pausanias and the 19th century travel writing on the battlefield, seeing ancient places and events in extended dialogue with other critical periods in the history of Greece, including our own, is something we increasingly have come to need and expect. We are grateful to someone so skilled in interweaving these narratives, and also someone who is just a great deal of fun as well. She was a great pleasure to have on the trips, organizing us in battle formation at each of the critical battlefields we visited. Scarlett Kingsley is an associate professor of classics at Agnes Scott College. Her research explores the intersections of early Greek historiography and philosophy, with a particular focus on Herodotus, Thucydides, and the pre-Socratics. This evening, her presentation takes on the first of these historians, Herodotus, and the final chapter of the Histories, which returns to the court of the first Persian king, Cyrus, and a discussion he has with his Persian subjects. Please join me in welcoming Scarlett Kingsley to speak on the context of the spear and the plow, imperial identity, and the hoplite-farmer. Scarlett.
Good evening, and thanks to Bonna for that very kind introduction. And I need to begin in general with many words of thanks. First, to the staff who have welcomed not only my husband and me, but also our two very active toddlers. And when I say active, I mean loud. To the librarians, especially Irene, who has been an invaluable aid in my work and in support of my seminar, and to Maria Georgopoulou, the director of the Gennadius, who has kindly opened up the doors and the books of the library to myself and to my seminar students. I thank our Mellon professor, Denver Graninger, for letting me tag along on some of the trips and talk a lot about, and sometimes, as you heard, recreate the battlegrounds. I am grateful to Fotini Kondili, my fellow Whitehead scholar, for keeping me caffeinated literally, but also intellectually, through her ever exciting and illuminating conversation, and to Bonna Westcote, whose support has just been unstinting. It's a special pleasure to return to the school as a Whitehead scholar. A decade ago, I first walked into the school as a regular member myself, and I became immersed in the study of ancient topography, history, and archaeology. And for me, a truly unique element in this experience was the introduction to Greece beyond antiquity, in particular to the modern Greek country. And I will never forget my own director, Jim Wright, who would read to us on the bus the poems of Seferis and Elitis and Cavafi. This year, I have had the privilege of seeing yet another angle of this beautiful country, and this time along an amazing set of regular members and also some stalwart associates on trips, and as we have explored, as you heard, the genre of travel writing in my seminar on Pausanias and the 19th century British travel writers. So I'm indebted to the students whose curiosity and insight and generosity of thought has again transformed my understanding of Greece in ways that I just could never have anticipated. So to you all, I offer my sincerest gratitude. Now, let's begin this talk. Okay, so we're going to go back in time, and not to antiquity, but to December 6, 1935. On this date, the Reich aviation minister Hermann Göring gave a speech to shipyard workers in Hamburg on the subject of German rearmament, and he voiced what would become an influential piece of Nazi propaganda. He said, "Ore has always made an empire strong, butter and lard have at most made a people fat." And at this time, Germany was suffering from crippling food shortages of really basic goods, things like bread and meat and eggs. And so it was actually forced to maintain a police presence at the marketplace. And just in the month prior to this, the government had begun to ration butter and argued that the currency was needed to purchase armaments. So central to Göring's understanding of the German economy in this period is the notion that its purpose is not the support or the improvement of the German people, but the preparation of the country for war. And Göring's words herald an aggressive militarism designed to spur citizen self-sacrifice. And this message was very widely disseminated in the Nazi information ecosystem. So in a speech that was given 6 weeks later, in January 1936, the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, affirmed, "We can manage without butter, but not, for example, without guns. If we are ever attacked, we cannot defend ourselves with butter, only with guns." Then in 1940, Adolf Hitler himself reiterated this, but with a notable modification. You want guns instead of butter. Well, the slogan is not guns or butter, but rather guns or slavery. That is the choice. And there is only one answer. I'd rather have guns. Hitler reframes the opposition not as one of guns versus butter, but war versus enslavement, casting his government's austerity measures as an existential imperative. And this rhetoric inspired one of the most famous images of anti-fascist art, a 1935 photo montage by the exiled German graphic artist John Hertfield. In it, Hertfield satirizes the absurdity of Nazi logic by posing a patriotic family at dinner. And you can see that the adults in the family, they meet the food shortages by eating various pieces of scrap metal and a bicycle. The dog is gnawing on a screw, and the baby is teething on an axe. And they exclaim, "Hurrah, die Butter ist alle," or "Hooray, there is no more butter." And this is a sharp critique of the trade-off that the Nazi war economy demanded of its people. At stake in Nazi Germany's binary opposition of guns versus butter is not simply the military orientation of the economy, but the deployment of a discourse of power. This economy of knowledge, prepare for war or gorge yourself, prepare for war or be enslaved, is one that naturalizes aggressive militarism as a rejection of excess and as part of a noble struggle for freedom. So it perpetuates a kind of self-serving ideological framework, what we might call a military identity complex. Now, what I will argue in this talk is that the binary opposition, guns versus butter, finds an analog in ancient Greek political discourse in terms of the opposition of the spear and the plow, as my title indicates. So I'm going to suggest that it is evident in particular in the description and analysis of imperial powers. And making this case, I hope to draw out a neglected dimension in the discourse of empire while also offering new insights into how people are conceptualizing agricultural land. So the talk is comprised of 3 interrelated sections. In the first part, I explore the way in which 5th century authors begin to problematize farming and militarism and to make these spheres distinct, or to put them in contradistinction to one another. And I want to focus on the examples of Persia and Athens. In the second portion of the talk, I look at the reception of the Athenian Empire and its embrace of militarism over agrarianism. And in the third section, finally, I examine 2 4th century BCE counter-narratives that complement this model. So that's the plan of my talk. Now, if we turn to the final chapter of Herodotus's Histories, we can find a striking variation on the guns versus butter dichotomy. The Histories culminates in the failure of the Persians at Plataea and Mycale. After the siege of Cestus, however, Herodotus goes back in time and he goes east in space to focus on a revealing moment in early Persian imperial history. It's a conversation that takes place between Cyrus, who is the first Persian king and the founder of its empire. And he talks with one of his subjects through a series of intermediaries. And the subject is named Artambares. So Artambares has a bold plan. He says, let's emigrate to a place that is more fertile so people admire us more. He says, we already rule all of Asia, so let's just take one of our neighbors' territories for ourselves, and Persis is a small and harsh land, and so this makes sense for us. So he envisions a kind of a colonial mission without the need for exploration. The imperial Persians will simply supplant one of their subject populations. Cyrus, however, rejects the idea outright. And agricultural potentiality shapes his speech, much as it did Ardambari's, in fact. Cyrus warns that the Persians will become he warns the Persians, rather, that from soft lands are born soft men, for it is not possible for the same land to produce fruit that is marvelous and men brave in the affairs of war. And what stands out to me in this exchange is how Cyrus equates Persian identity with military prowess and imperial rule. So he perceives in Ardambari's proposal a kind of existential threat, and this conditions his hostility to it. Agricultural productivity becomes, on Cyrus's reading, the pursuit of an ethos at odds with Persia and its excellence in the affairs of war. So the Persians are rulers, not subjects, noble in war, and not cowards. And the Persians ultimately agree with the Great King and choose to remain in Persis and to maintain their empire. And Herodotus' final sentence powerfully confirms this, as the Persians choose to rule from the Iranian homeland rather than be enslaved farmers elsewhere. This zero-sum configuration equates a fertile land with agrarianism and enslavement, and a harsh territory with militarism and the rule over others. The contrast of farming and militarism might be thought obvious here, or at least I hope it is. But scholars have been slow to identify this opposition as significant. Farming versus agrarianism is often, or it is just historically ignored in favor of other salient binaries, things like determinism versus contingency, or luxury versus austerity, or hard versus soft. In a very good book, the scholars Gorman and Gorman are really exceptional in even bringing it up, but they do so essentially to throw their hands in the air. So they say, we can assume for Herodotus' audience no association between agriculture and a life of unusual ease, nor would those familiar with the culture of the hoplite-farmer readily see an antithesis between cereal agriculture and military strength. So in effect, what they're saying is that this ending has no meaning for a Greek audience. And this conclusion is not all that surprising. We can think about, for example, the influential thesis of Victor David Hansen, that the hoplite-farmer is responsible for all Hellenic culture and its values, and Hansen, himself a farmer, argues that the ancient Greek yeoman who worked a small plot of land, 10 to 12 acres, was the foundation of a new middle class emerging out of the Dark Ages, who were empowered to purchase their own arms and thus establish egalitarian government and also modes of fighting. This is his thesis. And he goes on to state that Greek fighting of the Polish should never be discussed outside of the context of farming. And seen in this light, Cyrus's opposition does seem incongruous in terms of a Hellenic listening public. Yet, there is a strange insistence to Cyrus's binarism. In ring composition with this final passage in Herodotus' Histories, Cyrus, when we're talking about the foundation of the Persian Empire, interestingly makes use of the exact same antithesis. So in Book 1, the Persians are still subjugated by the Medes, and Cyrus intends to get them to revolt, and he arranges a cunning ruse to do this. So he says, I've been declared the strategos, the general of you Persians, and then he says, I want you to go and to clear with a scythe a rough and stony area for cultivation. And then the next day, he gathers together the same group of Persians for a feast of meat and wine in a meadow, and it said he's been prepared to receive the army of the Persians. Now, when everyone has eaten, Cyrus brings up the question, which he's been preparing this whole time, which is, which day did you prefer? Unsurprisingly, the Persians prefer feasting to agricultural labor, and Cyrus uses this to instigate them to revolt against their overlords, the Medes, and he does so by calling attention to their military prowess. So he says, I consider you no worse than the Medes in any other respect and not in war. And the object lesson here is clear. The army will enjoy the fruits of others' labor on campaign, as they do Cyrus's meat and wine. Alternatively, the Persian farmer toils in a harsh land without even the enjoyment of his own produce. By orchestrating this revolt, Cyrus does more than rally the Persians. He redefines their collective identity. This ruse becomes a kind of symbolic initiation into Persia's military identity complex. The narrator corroborates this, describing the Medians afterward as, quote, bowed under the Persian yoke, hupe kupsan persesi, in a pointed agricultural metaphor. Enslaved and free are coded to agriculture and warfare, and this creates an imperial charter according to which Persian autonomy equates with empire, its subjects are its chattel. The Persians are not alone in this emphasis on placing the spear over the plow. In Egypt, Herodotus refers to the presence of a warrior class, the Calasaires and Hermotibies, and this class, we're told, is awarded generous portions of land that they receive the harvest from. But Herodotus is careful to say that they practice no other art than that of war. And it seems to suggest that he's envisioning the kind of helotage that we find in places like Sparta and Thessaly. Herodotus adds that in addition to the Egyptians, many other peoples place emphasis on exclusive militarism. So warriors constitute the most important class of individuals among the Greeks, the Thracians, the Scythians, the Persians, and the Lydians. And he says, as well as most other peoples. Those especially devoted to the art of war are ranked the best, and he singles out among the Greeks, the Spartans, as uniquely committed to this practice. And of course, we have to think of their subjugation of the Helots. Elsewhere in the Thracian ethnography, Herodotus says that the Thracians believe that not working the ground is noblest, and it is most ignoble to till the earth. Living by war and plundered is considered the noblest. So the history's attention to the specialization of a warrior class and its distance from agricultural labor points backwards and forwards to this Persian choice at these two crucial moments. I want to turn to one final episode in the histories that is relevant for this argument. Immediately before Cyrus's parting words to the Persians at the end of the histories, he describes how the Athenian navy sails to Abydos, at which point the Peloponnesians say bye, they're done with the campaigning season. But the Athenians and their allies continue on and lay siege to Sestos, and it's going to be a successful siege. But Herodotus stops and pauses to focus, before discussing the success, on the emotional impact of being on campaign for the Athenians. He notes that the Athenians grew despondent at being absent from their land. And this is a feeling that's intensified by the time of year, autumn. The soldiers attempt to get the generals to lead them back, but the generals say they can't, not until they take Sestos, or they're recalled by the demos. But the temporal marker here of autumn is significant. For the hoplite-farmer, the autumn is the busiest time of the agricultural calendar. As you can see from the screen, farming activities from September to December are crucial. It is when the farmer is engaged in clearing fields, harvesting the vintage and figs, watering and later plowing and sowing cereals, trenching and manuring, picking olives, and of course, pressing them. And we recall that the traditional hoplite warfare takes place only from spring to early summer, when the crops are nearly ready to go, and this is specifically to limit the disruption to the farmer. The siege of Sestos then ruptures the farming calendar. But the general's insistence that they remain on campaign and the hoplites' acquiescence to this portends a shift in Athenian priorities. This mission, conducted on behalf of allies in a region that will very soon be part of the so-called Delian League, foreshadows Athenian imperial interests. And if this is correct, then the Athenians at the end of the histories are being positioned as moving onto the path toward empire, and one that the Persians have already trod. It is especially striking that the Athenians don't return home given the outsized role that Demeter has played in the final phase of the Greco-Persian Wars, and this is something that Deborah Bodeker has very convincingly argued. According to Herodotus, the invading Persians witness a marvelous dust cloud and a mystic cry near Demeter's sanctuary at Eleusis, and they take this as signs that she's determined to work on behalf of the Greeks. Likewise, Demeter is said to have protected her grove, the Demetrion, during the Battle of Plataea so that there was no combat or death or supplication there. And Herodotus doesn't often speculate on the divine, but he does here, and he sort of hazards that Demeter protected the Demetrion to avenge those who had burned her sanctuary at Eleusis. Demeter's sanctuary is also prominently situated near the final battle at Mycale, as Herodotus takes pains to note. And the notion of Demeter's personal intervention in the Greco-Persian Wars indicates the importance of the agrarian character of the Greeks and the Athenians in particular. Herodotus' emphasis on Demeter's protection of the land and the sharp contrast with the anti-agrarian Persian seems to represent a kind of quiet critique of placing the spear over the plow. Now, so far, I have argued that in key passages in the histories, there is a concern with agrarianism and its opposite, militarism. While militarism is a defining trait of Herodotus' Persians, I suggest we also see an early emergence among the Athenians. And to me, this raises an immediate and deep question. What is upstream of this? What is driving this opposition? Why does Herodotus keep on insisting that we need to see these spheres in contrast to one another? And to answer this, we need to turn to the historian's own contemporary historical moment, and there's a broad consensus that the histories is shaped by Herodotus' composing and performing it in the early period of the Peloponnesian War. And he alludes to the beginning of the war on several occasions. So in what follows, I will argue that it is during this period that the hoplite and the farmer emerge as hostile counterparts, and that this tension shapes the way that Herodotus narrates the imperial trajectory of both the Athenians and the Persians in the histories. At the start of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians adhered famously to the Periclean strategy, which demanded a large-scale evacuation of the Attic countryside. And this, paired with uniquely long campaigns that were undertaken during the war, appears to have very negatively impacted the Attic farmer. In Thucydides' History, the statesman Pericles explains his strategy in the first speech he gives, not simply by offering arguments on behalf of this temporary evacuation, but by launching into a sustained critique of agrarianism, which he opposes to Athenian thalassocracy. First, Pericles attacks the Peloponnesian, who he says as farmers will be too poor to engage in long-distance warfare at sea. Farmers will keep them from engaging in naval and land-based war, since they will be unable to be, he says, absent from their own property. In addition, the farmers' lack of capital will prove a strategic disadvantage, since they will leverage their own bodies on behalf of the war, but given its likely prolongment, those bodies will fail. By contrast, the Athenians almost uniquely, not totally uniquely, but almost uniquely can campaign outside of the traditional agricultural timetable, and this is because they can retreat behind the walls, and this is because they can import all the food that they need through the Piraeus. Pericles warms to his theme in his description of the nautical expertise that the Athenians have cultivated over time, and by contrast, he says that the Peloponnesians certainly cannot bring this feat off again, since they are farmers and not seafaring peoples. By contrast, the Athenians should imagine themselves as islanders, but just not simply islanders who have no hora, or hinterland. They are to give up the land and homesteads and stand guard over the sea and their polis. And Pericles drives home his anti-agrarianism by admonishing the Athenians for even lamenting their households and their lands. And he actually proposes that they should ravage these themselves rather than letting the Lacedaemonians do it. Notably, the Spartans are presented as very alive and familiar with the fact that the Athenians are alienated from their own hinterland. The Spartan ruler Archidamus argues against the war by saying that the tactic of invading Attica and ravaging the harvest will hardly work against them, since he says the Athenians are not enslaved to their land. The conceptualization here of farming as a form of human bondage is noteworthy, in particular in light of what we saw in Cyrus's words in Book 1 and Book 9 of the Histories. And it is also uniquely appropriate, since it's a focalization of a Spartan who exploits enslaved helot agricultural labor. In sum, Pericles devalues the place of farming within Attica by pointing to the weaknesses that agriculturalism creates for the Peloponnesians. And this rhetorical thrust naturalizes the evacuation of the Attic countryside as necessary and even ultimately as desirable for the Athenians and their empire. The opposition of the Athenians and Peloponnesians in binary terms as land versus sea people is, of course, highly schematized and elides the real historical complexities of both power blocks. We could talk about the Spartans, for example. Still, Pericles' speech is valuable for its depiction of an ideological battle that is being fought by this more literal one. And the success of Athenian propaganda seems clear from the reception of the Periclean strategy in what is otherwise the hostile source, the old oligarch. The old oligarch praises the Athenians for placing their goods on the islands and looking on while their territory is ravaged, recognizing its relative lack of importance for their actual interests. And the author also notes the wisdom of their reliance on sea rather than agriculturalism by drawing attention to the prevalence of crop failures. After all, Athens can import whatever it needs. Agricultural powers are subject to the vagaries of the harvest season. Beyond Thucydides and the old oligarch, the antagonism between the farmer and the hoplite is also prevalent in the comic polis of Aristophanes, and in the extant full comedies and in the fragments, Aristophanes' protagonists regularly reject warfare in favor of an idealized countryside that is characterized by fertility and feasting. And this rejection clashes often to comic effect with the exigencies of wartime. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of this phenomenon in Aristophanes, but we could multiply the passages many times over here. So the Agrarians in 425, for example, lampoons the length of the war and its impact on the countryside by pitting the farmer Dichotomy, who is introduced as longing for peace, gazing at the fields, against the veteran Acarnanians and also Lamachus, a general who was infamously over-devoted to the war. And Aristophanes critiques the duration of the war through Lamachus, who hawkishly declares, "I polemeso, I will always war against every Peloponnesian everywhere with the navy and the infantry." Unending war counters the traditional model of seasonal warfare, and this is a tradition that Dichotopolis' personal treaty wants to reinstate so he can go back to his farm and enjoy in gluttonous excess, of course, the life of the country. Aristophanes' fragmentary farmers likewise laments the loss of productivity during the war. At least one character makes an attempt, just like Dichotopolis, to work the land in spite of the threat of enlistment. So he says, "I want to farm," and offers to bribe someone 1,000 drachmas for release from service. In 421, in the peace, among a chorus of traders, artisans, craftsmen, medics, and islanders, it is the farmers alone who are responsible for retrieving peace from the pit in which she has been confined by war. And the chorus of farmers is then dismissed to their homes with the explicit renunciation of their weaponry for the resumption of their life of ease. And the totalizing language of either perpetual war or peace continues here as the farmer Tragaeus promises mistress, i.e. peace, we will never let you go. At the end of the comedy, Tragaeus marries an attendant of peace, and this is the personification of harvest. And he prays to gather again all the good things that had been lost and to leave off from the flashing sword. As James F. McGlew interprets it, peace is really a matter of identity in Aristophanes, and the farmer is uniquely capable of appreciating its advantages. In opposing ways, Athenian political discourse during the Peloponnesian War showcases the primacy of the spear versus the plow debate. In doing so, this discourse establishes a framework for the reception of the empire in the 4th century and beyond. And so in the second part of the talk, I'm going to turn to this reception. The 4th century Aristotelian Athenian constitution offers an early example of this dichotomy. And in it, the author says that the 6th century tyrant Pisistratus subsidized the Athenian people's farming to keep them from gathering in the city of Athens and taking an interest in politics. Of course, this would endanger his rule over them. The tyrant even establishes a group of itinerant justices, and he's one of them, and they travel throughout the hinterland and do so settling disputes to keep the populace from coming into the city and neglecting their tilling. The Athenian constitution goes on to show how the democracy reverses this tyrannical policy during the Greco-Persian Wars. The Athenian politician Aristides became the architect of the empire by advising the Athenians after the wars to leave their farms and inhabit the political center at Athens. And he even promises food to these groups in an implicit replacement of the agricultural production that they would have made. So tribute and taxes will now easily support the enlarged urban population and the imperial democracy. Here, the Athenians are presented as launching into political hegemony over their allies via a departure from their farms. Here, too, serving in the army is conceived of as an activity that is at odds with farming. Now, there's no clear and uncontroversial evidence for Athenians migrating en masse to the city, to the polis, from the countryside prior to the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. And there's also no reason to think that the democracy created this vast public funds system so early. This suggests that a historical distortion is taking place for the sake of a neat ideological schema, and that is guns versus butter. As at the end of Herodotus' Histories, the rejection of the countryside signals a commitment to imperial aspirations. Like Cyrus, Aristides spurs his people to enjoy agricultural bounty via subject peoples through their imperial rule. And we see variants on this theme in other figures associated with the origins of the Athenian Empire, like Themistocles and Cimon. So in Plutarch's Life of Themistocles, he explains that after the Greco-Persian Wars, Themistocles fitted the whole city to the sea, and this transgressed the practices of the old kings of Athens, who had habituated the populace to live scattered from one another, sowing the land. These kings even enlisted mythology to support the social order, and they popularized the struggle between Poseidon and Athena for Athens. And of course, Athena's victory over her rival with the olive tree is heralded as the emblem of the agrarian nature of Athens, not the maritime nature of the state. So here too, the strategy of the rulers is designed to diminish the people's leisure through hard labor in the fields and to keep it from political activity and organization. And the democracy symbolically counters this focus on the land. So Plutarch states that the demos orients the speaker's platform in the assembly to look towards the sea. During the reign of the tyrants, however, it was strategically moved to face inland, as the tyrants supposed that the origins of the democracy were in their empire by the sea and that oligarchy was less disagreeable to farmers. Plutarch's Themistocles follows the historical patterning that we saw in the Athenian constitution, where cultivation is associated with political inertness and pacifism, and it's opposed to the early Delian League, to the Athenian democracy, and to the turn to maritime empire. Plutarch's account of the evolution of the Delian League from alliance to empire incorporates these same themes. So in his Life of Cimon, Cimon is faced with the increasing unwillingness of the allies to contribute men and manned ships, even as they continue to pay tribute. And the reasoning of the allies here is telling. They say, at this time they were renouncing campaigns, not needing war anymore, desiring to farm and live at their ease. While his generals unpopularly attempted to extract the members' active military service, Cimon decides to adopt a more conciliatory policy. So he takes the money and empty ships from the allies who don't want to serve in the military, and he allows them to be baited by leisure, to become from those who were once warlike farmers and moneymakers. At the same time, Cimon put the Athenians on ships and cultivated them as those who were able to labor on campaign. And in doing so, he made the Athenians ever under arms, the masters of the allies who became tributaries and slaves unaccustomed to military service. Chimon's strategy transitions the Athenians from league members to hegemons precisely by working with and not against the traditional agrarianism that was practiced by the allies. So again, farming is associated with this life of ease and a rejection of military action. The irony of islanders uniquely attached to their land while the mainland Athenians turned to the sea is clear from the metaphors that Plutarch uses. So the allies are being baited like fish, deleiades dominus, and Cimon cultivates diaponon, the Athenians' expertise in war. Emphasis is put on the exceptional temporality of this training, as the Athenians are always under arms. Equally, the association of farming and subjugation is made clear as it paves the way for the allies' loss of political autonomy, even as it aligns them with the enslaved and empire with freedom. And this is the first explicit reference that we've seen yet to the allies and their emplotment within this farming militarism binary. And it is striking that Cimon views them as those enslaved to a life of ease, those who are fearful, those who are flattering. Cimon then emerges as a figure who pushes forward this Aristidean or Themistoclean agenda and advocates for Athenian imperial rule. And he does so by encouraging agrarianism for the allies and militarism for the Athenians. And notably, this strongly moralized language places the blame squarely on the shoulders of the allies, as those ultimately responsible for their own domination. For Plutarch, the Athenians, ever under arms, become the rightful rulers of their dissolute and enervated farming subjects. In the aftermath of the Athenian Empire, then, Aristides, Themistocles, and Cimon were each remembered as catalysts at key historical junctures in the transition of the Athenians into this imperial maritime power. Often this was conceived of as a democratic departure from the archaic kings or from the tyrant and their prioritization of the countryside. The trope expands to include a view of the allies, as we saw, as a new farming class of the Athenians, those responsible for the economic surplus that allows for Athenian pursuit of militarism and democratic autonomy. Now, I want to just note that it would be very hazardous to interpret any of these examples as deriving from 5th century sources. I don't want to do that. But at least by the 4th century, as is clear from the Athenian constitution, this historical emplotment has started to gain ground. I want to observe, however, that there are counter-narratives opposing the exclusive pursuit of militarism and the coding of agriculture to slavery. So not everyone agrees with this. Xenophon's treatise, the Oikonomicus, is a dialogue between Socrates and Critobulus on the art of state management that offers an extended praise of agrarianism as a matrix for elite self-fashioning, and it argues for its interdependence with militarism. So Socrates says that the so-called banausic or the mundane occupations destroy the body and soul of the citizen, and that city-states who have a reputation for excellence in war don't even allow their citizens to engage in any of these jobs because he says that they'll prove unwilling to defend their land if they engage in them. When Critobulus asks, okay, well, what should an ideal citizen be doing? Socrates turns to farming as the best work for the kalos kagathos, but does so significantly by continually highlighting its compatibility with war. The case study of this compatibility is none other than the Persian Great King Cyrus, who Socrates says cares strongly for both of these things, agriculture and the art of war, considering them among the noblest and most necessary objects. Critobulus is surprised at the Persian ruler's diligence in farming, and Socrates has to clarify with an explanation of how the king's attention to military affairs entails an awareness of and a regard for agriculturalism. So he says he or his surveyors inspect the land and they have rewards or punishments for those whose territory is really well taken care of or really poorly taken care of. And he also connects military defense to agricultural productivity. So, for example, the garrison commander is protecting the territory in order to maximize its agricultural potentiality. So Critobulus is led to admit that the state of affairs suggests that the king is equally interested in agriculture and militarism. But Socrates is not done. It's not just that he's an overseer of these activities. He wants to note that he embodies excellence in both of these domains. So once we're told during an interview with those that Cyrus is supposed to give awards to as being uniquely preeminent in both farming and in militarism or warfare, Cyrus told those who had been summoned to receive these rewards that he himself had a right to receive in both categories. For, he said, he was best at cultivating land and at defending the land he had cultivated. Again, the interrelation of farming and warfare is here highlighted, and Xenophon presents Cyrus as an exemplar of the Persian rulers' allegedly traditional support of both agriculture and militarism. And Socrates singles out Cyrus as an illustrious king and as an ideal ruler. He not only rewards his subjects, but engages directly in physical toil of cultivation and in war. And he's notably Aristos, or the best, in terms of all others. Following on this description, Socrates abruptly shifts the discussion to Cyrus the Younger's remarkable ability to inspire loyalty in his followers. And the transition from Cyrus the Elder to Cyrus the Younger happens very quietly. We're not given any notice in the text that we've switched people, which has led folks to believe that there's something wrong with the manuscript. From my point of view, Cyrus the Elder and Cyrus the Younger are narrative doubles, and they are both paradigms of the warrior farmer. So we're told that Cyrus the Younger once entertained the Spartan Lysander at his Paradisos in Sardis. And the general, he starts to admire these trees, which he thinks are amazing, and the beauty of them, and he praises the person who organized this Paradisos. And at this point, Cyrus the Younger says, well, it was me, I did it. And Xenophon offsets the potential complaint from the audience that, is this Persian, grandee who might traditionally be associated in this period with luxury, really going to dirty his hands. And so he has Cyrus observe the beauty he has Lysander observe Cyrus's clothing, his perfume, his jewelry, and he says, did you really plant these things with your hands? And Cyrus, he shares this anecdote. He says, I never dine before breaking a sweat, either engaging in warfare or in a farming activity. The introduction of Lysander and his curiosity about Cyrus's physical exertion and cultivation is poignant given the Spartans' rejection of farming for the pursuit of warfare. As an example of Spartan norms, Plutarch's Apothegmata Laconica preserves an anecdote said to be from the expansionist 6th century king of Sparta, Anaxandridas, that justifies their rejection of cultivation. So in this anecdote, someone comes to the Spartan king and they ask, why do you entrust these farms to the helots rather than working them yourselves? And he replies, because it was by taking care of ourselves and not the fields that we acquired them. So in Xenophon, there's clearly a clash of ideologies here, but Lysander's praise of Cyrus seems to point or to tilt the emphasis in the direction of the Persian model and away from Sparta. Following this, Socrates confirms to Critobulus that farming represents the ideal opportunity for cultivating the body of the warrior, and it offers an incentive for the defense of the land. So when Socrates comes to summarize his argument as a whole, he views this part of the dialogue as saying that the best work and knowledge is devoted to farming. Xenophon's carefully elaborated portrait of the ruler harmonizes then agriculture and warfare, and this points to something new, to the ethical importance of farming for the citizen. In making the case that he does, Xenophon's Socrates contributes to a contemporary philosophical debate on the place of the citizenry in agriculture. So in Plato's Republic, for example, you might recall that Plato says that each individual, there's a natural division of labor, and each individual is suited to do one thing only. And so the guardians are explicitly made to refrain from farming, as well as any other handicrafts or any other money-making enterprises. And this finds a parallel in Plato's Critias, where ancient Athens apparently had a warrior class who could live free from farming because of the exceptional fertility of Attica in that really ancient period that he's describing fantastically, mythically. Aristotle, however, is more ambivalent about the place of the hoplite-farmer within the state. So in the politics, for example, he says that the best democracy is one that is dependent on agrarianism and it needs a citizen class of farmers. But in his ideal constitution, Aristotle says that it is better to enfranchise the warriors and not the farmers. And he actually makes the farming class, he says, either an enslaved population or they can be medics. And it's noteworthy here that Aristotle introduces some historical exempla to back this up. He says this is how it was with Sesostris in Egypt, this is how it was with Minos in Crete. For both Aristotle and Plato, the ideal state segregates agriculture from the practice of war while elevating the social standing of the soldier in the citizenry. So Xenophon's Socratic dialogue departs sharply from this tradition in its defense of the value of farming within the civic body as virtuous on its own terms, and as indeed the ideal training ground for war. But in another sense, we could also say that Xenophon is obviously responding to Herodotus' Cyrus. So in the histories of Herodotus, Cyrus never entertains the possibility that warfare and farming are going to be compatible with one another, and he, in fact, twice rejects the activity for the Persians, and as we saw, associates it with weakness and enslavement. Cyrus's conclusion of the histories sees a Persian recommitment to war, empire, and implicitly expansionism. In the Oikonomicus, however, Xenophon's Cyrus suggestively engages in both of these activities, and his cultivation of the land is balanced by his explicit protection of it. And this defensive action speaks to his role as a shepherd of the people rather than as an aggressive imperialist. Xenophon's Cyrus is then a canny rewriting of the Herodotean monarch, one who repudiates excessive militarism and rehabilitates Cyrus as a model of benevolent rule on the farmstead and on campaign. But as we saw, the elevation of farming here comes by binding it to militarism, so it never rejects militarism in total. Before concluding, I want to turn your attention to one final passage that reverses the consistent idealization of militarism that we have seen so far. The extant and anonymous Kertamen Homeri at Hesiode is dated to the 2nd century CE, but it seems to have its origins in a 4th century text by a sophist Alcidamus in his Museion, so 4th century BCE. It recounts a contest between Homer and Hesiod on Chalcis in Euboea, drawing on Hesiod's own account, of course, of the victory he won at the funeral games of Amphidamas on this island. And the contest ends between these two with a surprise request from King Panides, and he asks each poet to perform his best verses. So Hesiod goes on and he recites the start of the farming calendar. These are lines that describe the path of the Pleiades against the backdrop of the harvest seasons. Homer, however, he delivers a mashup of two passages depicting the two Ajaxes and Achaeans in a stylized hoplite-like line. So you have spear against spear, you have shield against shield in opposition to Trojans and also Hector. And this passage is a sensory marvel. There is the din of the spears and the blinding light of this armor, and the people of Chalcis are just amazed. They're struck dumb, essentially. They marvel, according to the text. And they immediately judge Homer the winner. And in one variant, actually, the audience is explicitly described as composed of the elites and the soldiers. So this naturalizes why Homer becomes quickly the favorite. So in a reversal of popular opinion, however, the audience's favor is rejected by King Panides. And the king announces that it is just that the one who called to mind farming and peace win, not the one detailing wars and slaughters. And in making his judgment, the king stresses the didactic value of epic poetry, which he views as contributing to civic harmony. The Kertamen tradition is thus an example of the rejection of warfare as deleterious to the citizen body in a refutation of the imperial rhetoric that I have discussed today. So let me sum up at this point. Scholars of classical Athens have often taken for granted the compatibility and the inextricability, even, of the spear and the plow. With reference to evidence that is in Herodotus, Thucydides, and Aristophanes, I have suggested that there is a deep tension that emerges in the 15th century that disrupts the harmonious coexistence of these two spheres, and that this is shaped by a thalassocratic imperial ideology. the opposition becomes of these two spheres, that is, becomes a kind of historical knowledge and a framework for conceptualizing rule over others. And this, we saw, was attested in the reception of the Athenian Empire from the 4th century onward. So the historical memory surrounding Aristides, Themistocles, and Cimon dramatizes the Athenian rejection of the hinterland and its embrace of the sea. But still, we do see this counter-narrative in Xenophon, who critiques the separation of these activities and reframes agrarianism as the ideal activity of the citizen. And for him, cultivation is self-cultivation. This reformulation lends itself to a species of rule by consent of the governed. Finally, in a highly ambivalent moment, the Kertamen appears to adjudicate for the poetry of peace over the poetry of war and to privilege butter over guns. As in the case of Nazi Germany, the logic of aggressive militarism is not without its discontents. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that stimulating presentation, and we'll be willing to take questions from the audience here in Coates Hall and then also the audience online. So we'll start with the hall here. I think James.
Thanks, Scarlett.
Yeah.
I'm wondering. So you mentioned. Well, you didn't mention, you more than mentioned, that Book 9, Chapter 117 sets up this association between the final decision by the Persians and what's happening in Athens. But you also referred a few times to the fact that this warfare, farming contrast also maps pretty well onto the Spartans and their enslavement of the Messenians. And I guess 117 notwithstanding, does it change things if when we get to 122 we're not supposed to think of this is like the Athenians and their empire, but rather this is like these two empires that are now fighting one another? I mean, does that affect it, or is it the same, I don't know, the same associations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Herodotus is interested in the Spartans, I mean, specifically in the histories. He's interested in what the Spartans are doing, and he mentions the Helots on several occasions. And he also, there's this passage where he talks about how the Spartans go and they want to conquer, they want to be an imperial power, which they are, but in Tegea. And so they, get their chains ready and they go, but they're defeated. And their punishment is very poetic, because he says that they're then put into a chain gang and they're forced to work the fields like the Helots. That is, they become their own subject population. So I think he's really aware of the fact that the Athenians that the Spartans are represented in these ways, and that that's disturbing, because he does seem to kind of critique this mode, I would say. I think maybe the reason I haven't really been as on board with interpreting the Spartans as sort of another intertext in this final passage in 9:122 is the Athenians are explicitly there. They're really on the path, and they get this right like 4 chapters before they get this this moment where they're disturbingly rejecting agriculture. And it's more like the Spartans have always been like that, but it's also the question of, they don't use, and they're not used, the language of arche is not used of them, and nor is the language of phoros. So there's not been, I think, a tradition of interpreting what they're doing in the same way because of the lack of ancient language that associates them with an imperial power. But in terms of the way I think about empire, I think they fit that model really well. And I think it's interesting to think about them in that context. Just one more thing that I want to say is that there's been a suggestion that I think is an interesting one by Van Vase, that places like Sparta and Thessaly, which seem really strange, are actually the way things were happening in the Archaic period. And so, and that maybe Athenians have departed from that, but there's also this sort of strange parallelism that does develop. I guess I do want to think about the Spartans more, and I certainly think that by the time where you have in the Peloponnesian War this narrative of the Athenians rejecting their hinterland, that they look a lot like Sparta. Although in the Pericles speech, Pericles pretends like the Lacedaemonians are very different. But of course Sparta doesn't operate on a timetable like the rest of the Peloponnesians, because they can, as long as there's not a festival, which there always is, but they can go out whenever they want on campaign, and they look very much like the Athenians. So I think it's important to keep the Spartans in mind. Thanks for drawing them out.
Thank you very much for this. I was just wondering, when we look at some of the reactions to the position that you've been telling us about that's most associated with the Athenians and has this sort of pejorative view towards agriculture and soft living, sometimes are these reactions kind of accepting the validity of the premise that agriculture is threatening, though? I mean, just today, literally at your suggestion, I was reading through Zenophon, and it kind of feels like his notion of enkratia and the kalos kagathos is saying, yes, living this way is morally threatening, but since we aren't going to, move to Persis, we have to find some way to accommodate that, and having an idea of self-mastery is part of how we let ourselves nevertheless be farmer gentlemen and live in the soft country. So do you think that there's kind of an accepting reactionary response that happens later in this tradition? Is that a possible way to frame it?
So wait, you're saying that, specifically Xenophon is accepting of this model? That is, you don't buy the fact that he wants to embrace farming?
Oh, no, I think I probably just talked in circles and said it in a confusing way. I think he does want to accept farming, but I think that he both wants to accept farming and accepts the fact that it is a potentially dangerous thing to be doing, accepting the premise of this kind of Herodotean moment that you've shown us. And because he accepts all of this, he has to think up a way that you can nevertheless be a kalos kagathos while doing these things, which maybe isn't there as much in Herodotus.
Okay. Thanks. No, that's a great question. And yeah, does he think that farming is dangerous? I would say yes and no. I think you're right. He is very comfortable with the calculus that's presented at the end of Herodotus' Histories, where you need to engage in militarism in order to be successful. So he never sort of rejects that model. That's fine. In the Oikonomicus, he seems to suggest that if you're kalokagathos, you're just a better soldier if you engage in farming. It doesn't hurt you. If anything, it just improves your ability to get out there and defend the land. So I don't think he thinks it's dangerous if you're kalos kagathos. But what if you're not the kalos kagathos? And this is where I think it's interesting. If we take, for example, Xenophon's Cyropaedia, and we look at that text, he has this very disturbing passage. This is the novelization, the historical novelization of the Cyrus the Great's accession to power. And he has this very interesting and disturbing passage where he talks about the way in which once you become an imperial power, what do you do with the subject population? And he says you can't give them arms. He says you have to force them to become ergatas. That is, they have to become the tillers of the land, or the dasmophoros. Those people are not allowed to have arms. And he says, by contrast, you yourself have to constantly be under arms, you, the Persians. And so it seems like he's very alive to the importance of farming for the kalos kagathos, doesn't want to share the art of war unless you're part of that imperial in-group, that is, unless you're a Persian. And that's surprising and disturbing, I think, as a position. So thanks.
Esan? Okay, Esan, you're next.
Thank you, Scarlett, for this. I was wondering if this opposition between the spear and the plough is something that connects, the imperial ideology with Nazi Germany, or you can find this distinction in other cultures as well. For instance, I would be very interested to know what about America's imperial discourse, or British even.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find it anywhere other than Nazi Germany?
Guns versus butter starts in Nazi Germany, and it then is disseminated widely into every, essentially, Western political discourse.
I guess I'm not asking guns versus butter, I'm asking spear versus plough, because it seems to me, I mean, maybe, but this is maybe because I am Greek, that butter is not something, that I can see an analogy between butter and plough. So I was wondering if one could find an analogy, I mean, in modern imperial ideologies, which is closer to plough and spear in other imperial discourses.
Yeah, I think, so when you have the emergence in Nazi Germany of this discourse of guns versus butter, butter is very much tied to the agricultural productivity of the land. I mean, that's the way that they're thinking of it, and they're thinking of a total reorientation of the sort of productivity of the state away from that sector, and or sort of allowing the collapse of that sector versus the sort of the armament. So I actually do think, just to push up against that there is, maybe not in the Greek context, but certainly in the German context, there is a real alliance of those two spheres. And then, as I said, that does sort of spread out, so you find it in America as well. And there's a really good book by Bernstein, Guns or Butter, The Presidency of Lyndon Johnson, and sort of talks about the American context and how the privileging of the sort of military and industrial complex over the agricultural complex, it comes into conflict. So yeah, it does emerge in other societies and has, I think, also today active resonance.
Okay. I think Esan had a question. Yeah.
Hi, Scarlett. Thank you so much for your presentation. Sorry, I was late. I had a meeting. And
That's okay.
I was glad that you brought up Cyrus the Younger's paradise at Sardis, and I wanted to just make a comment on that.
Yeah.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. So that one has not been archaeologically attested because we don't know where Persian Sardis is. That's a gap in archaeology. But we have the paradise at Pasargade, which we think the one at Sardis is a replica of the one at Pasargade. And that one has archaeologically attested. And the interesting thing is that recently they found another site south of Pasargade, and they suggest that that one is a second garden paradise where the king would just go for hunting, and the one that where his tomb and other palaces were, where just like he had his garden with the plants from all over the empire. That's the new idea, and they've been doing archaeobotanic studies and things like that, and they've been also mentioned in Elamite tablets in Persepolis. I don't know, just a comment I thought.
No, thank you. That's really fascinating, and it raises an important question, which is, what is the historical backdrop of the way that Cyrus is being, or the Persian ruler is being, how they're being framed? And Herodotus does a shocking injustice. I mean, there's no way that, of course, militarism is very important, and no one would say that that's not true. But if you take, for example, Darius's letter to Herodotus, the great king there shows so much concern for the cultivation of the land and the transplanting of these trees, and the fascination with the paradisos just as a phenomenon shows you that this is such a ideologically motivated and driven narrative, and Xenophon's view is more historically accurate. So I just wanted to say that in light of your comments on the archaeological finds. Thanks.
Scarlett, we have a question online I could read. It's from an anonymous attendee, but they ask, I have a question about the embodied consequences of these ideologies for the people of the empire. Hesiod talks about the disabling consequences of an agricultural life. For example, we can easily understand the disabling consequences of warfare and of slavery. So what is at stake in this dichotomy for the people who will actually be the agents of the empire?
What is at stake for, what was the last part of this?
It was, so what is at stake in this dichotomy for the people who will actually be the agents of the empire?
Okay, for the agents of the empire, not for the subjects of the empire. Is that correct?
Well, I guess we'd have to tell my question. So I think yes, though.
Okay. Yeah. So already, let's go to the Odyssey. I mean, what does Laertes look like in Book 24, right? When we see him and he's farming, and he's in sort of tatters, and Odysseus, he wants to cry as soon as he sees him, and he actually calls him a slave. He sort of mocks him before he reveals himself. He can't hold it back anymore, and he finally reveals himself. But first he calls him a slave, and that's clearly because this is activity which is associated with the enslaved. That's absolutely correct. I don't think we can get around that. So yeah, Hesiod is also correct. It's incredibly difficult work. There's this discourse about it being a virtuous activity for the cultivation of the self, this kind of ethical farming, is a leisured and elite perspective. And it is a perspective which would have been for the 1%, right? On the basis of, good estimates from people like, for example, Jones, who's worked on the demos. On the farming societies in Attica. Most people in the 5th century are subsistence farmers in Attica. They have, small plots of land, but there is this other. There's this other set, and those are the Xenophons, and the Platos, the Alcibiades, and the Pericles, and the Chemons, etc. And they can view it. Those individuals can view it in this romanticized way. I don't think we need to. That's the reality is it's backbreaking work. It's extremely difficult. For the agents of empire, I think it's interesting to think about in the 5th century. How would they have viewed the increasing emphasis on militarism versus farming? And you have to remember that, from what we understand, in the Attic stelae, we have just some of these really wealthy individuals who have huge amounts of territory in the clericies. They're not there, though. They're just the rentier class. And so I don't think they would have necessarily been that bummed at the idea that, farming is not, something we can do in Attica. That's not that big of a problem for them. So yeah, I think they're alive to the dichotomy, and it's important, but it's not really going to impact them negatively if farming doesn't have this cachet, because they're not doing the work.
Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Well, then let's all go and enjoy a glass of wine and talk further with Scarlett and thank her for her presentation. We'll have the fruits of the farmer below. Thank you.